Hey everybody, Ryan Medora here, and welcome back to another bass lesson. And today we're going to be talking about adding some super funk and secret sauce to our bass grooves by learning a little bit about playing chords and using like a dominant chord to create something extra funky. So if you want to get tab notation, anything like that to accompany this lesson, head on over to my Patreon page and you can find it there. But in the meantime, let's talk a little bit about the theory behind what we're doing and then ways to craft a bass part. So the main goal of this is to really understand that we're going to be building dominant chords in two different positions on the bass and then using that to construct a cool funky bass groove. So when we play a dominant chord, what we're doing is we're starting with a major triad and we're adding the flat 7 or the minor 7th to it. So we're going to be working in the key of A, and we're going to find our A here on the 5th fret of our E string. And I'm going to start by just playing an A major triad and then adding the flat 7 or the dominant 7th to it. So that's going to be that G over there. So our dominant chord, the A7, as you would see it written, is going to go root, 3rd, 5th, throw that flat 7 there. So that's going to be an A, a C sharp, an E, and then we're going to throw that G as our 7th. So this is going to be your straight up dominant chord, A7. Now, to integrate this into a bass line, we want to kind of come up with some interesting ways to play this chord on the bass. So as you know, if you kind of play chords, you have to be a little bit creative with the way you include these voices. You know, if you play chords lower down, you know, it's going to sound a little muddy. You might not get that nice, crisp, clear sound of the chord. So we're going to come up with two different positions that we can play the chord in. The first position is going to be down here where we're going to play our root note. We're going to take this 3rd that if we played it here, those two notes together are going to sound a little muddy. So we're going to take that 3rd and throw it up an octave. So we're going to find that C sharp here on the 6th fret of our G string. And that's going to give us a nice spread of a 10th interval. So if you think about playing the root and the 3rd, we're taking that 3rd up an octave. So if you think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 gets it to the octave, 9, 10. 10 gives you that major 3rd an octave higher. So we're going to play our root note. We're going to play our 3rd an octave higher. That's going to be our 10th. And then we're going to throw that minor 7, the G, back in. And that's going to give us our dominant chord by starting with our root note on the E string. So you can kind of play this anywhere. Like we're playing an A7, but you could also play a C7. You could play a G7. You know, anywhere you want to put this chord in this shape, you can, as long as your root note is on your E string. But for our A7 chord, we have the root, the 7th, the G, and then that C sharp on top, that 3rd. Now you might be saying like, well, what about the 5th? Why are we not inviting this person to our party? And the answer to that is we want to try to just use the essential notes for building this chord. The 5th is cool, like it's in both major and minor. It's a nice way to round out the chord, but for our purposes here on the bass, you know, we can't let things get too complicated, too muddy. So we're going to take the 5th out because the root establishes the root note that we need. The 3rd is going to give us our major or minor quality, and then that 7th is going to give us that dominant quality. So those are the ones that are really carrying the most weight in terms of chord quality, so that's why we're going to include them with our A7 chord here. So this is the position we have. And you can play this in different ways. I usually like to either start with my middle finger and then use my ring and my pinky, or you could also use your index finger, your middle finger, and your pinky. Two different ways depending upon the other notes that you're going to try to hit in the creation of your bass line. So this is the first position that we can learn for establishing that A7 chord with the root note on the E string. Now what I like to do is also find this chord in a different register. So we're going to take this a bit higher and we are going to find this A7 shape up here. And we're going to kind of change the order of the notes a little bit. So this time we're going to use what I call like the triangle shape, where we're starting with our root note here on the 12th fret. So we have our 12th fret A. This time we're going to use our regular major 3rd, kind of in the normal position. So if you think root 3rd, and then we're going to just throw our 7th on top. So it's almost going to look like the shape of a triangle. And I like to use my middle finger for the root note, my index for the 3rd, and my ring for the 7th. And as you can see, again, we're omitting the 5th, and we don't necessarily need to have as big of a spread between the voices because we're in a higher register already now. And so we can kind of go back and forth between playing the two different versions of the A7 chord, down here and then up here. And that's pretty cool. So one great thing to do is just to get started is go back and forth between these two chord positions. So you can be like down here and then up here. And hear how it's like, oh yeah, these are just the same chord voiced in different ways in terms of the order that we have our root, third, and seventh, or root, seventh, third. So here's our root, third, seventh, the higher voicing. And then we have this lower voicing over here, root, seventh, third on top. So two different positions. And again, you can use these shapes for any key or any chord depending upon like where you're putting your root note. So again, if your root note is going to be on your E string, you can use that shape. And if your root note is going to be on your A string, you can use this shape. So even if you were to play like an E7, you can kind of find that 7th fret E and use that same shape there to create that little triangle shape to give you that E7 chord. But we're going to come back to our A7s and go back and forth, get that, familiar, find that shape that works for you. And then the next thing is saying like, okay, if we want to use this to create a bass line, we can use the chords themselves, or we can kind of use them in a little slinky way where we can, maybe play part of a chord. There I'm kind of just throwing some notes in and playing just the 7th and the 3rd on top. And then likewise, we can come up here and we don't have to play the chord in its entirety, but we could play, just the 3rd and the 7th, and that's going to give us that dominant chord, extra funky goodness that we want to have. So when we create this bass line, one thing that I like to do is use my root note and then play the higher voices. So I'm not necessarily playing all three at once, but I'm playing it rhythmically in an interesting way. So we have the root note followed by the higher notes of the chord. And I'm throwing in some extra fun, funky notes in here. I'm kind of sliding between using my minor third and major third, which is the C to C sharp, and then also the 6th to the flat 7th, which is this move right here, the F sharp to the G. So you can see that I'm using a lot of like kind of chromatic, funky notes. I'm going minor third into major third to have a nice little resolve there, and then that 6 to the flat 7. So I'm using kind of like half-step motion to resolve to chord tones, and that's where we get some of that funk happening. That's like we have a dissonance resolving to consonance, and that's like a really cool thing to create within your funk bass line. So one of the things that I'm doing here is, again, I'm playing my root note followed by the higher voices of the chord. And I can kind of play with my minor third to major third, C to C sharp, and then my 6th to flat 7, or the F sharp to the G. And then, if I want, I can kind of take myself up to these guys, that higher A7, just the top voices, the 3rd and the 7th. So I can kind of do a move like this. And that's a pretty cool thing to do, especially if you slide into that. I'm kind of doing a little slide into the 3rd and then throwing that 7 there. So I think the big thing to keep in mind is that as you're building this kind of funky bass line, we're playing chords and we're using that as the basis of what we're doing. But the way we attack them, the way we articulate them, those are the things that really bring the funk. It's like we're not just playing the blocks here and here. We're kind of choosing how to play a root note and the higher voices, or to slide into something and then maybe we slide into the 3rd and we add that 7th. That's that little nuance that makes it sound interesting and doesn't just say like, oh, we're playing this block here to this block there. We're giving it some rhythm, we're giving it some articulation, and that's the thing that really is going to define our groove. So there's a lot of stuff that you can do to get creative with this, and you can play around with other notes within our dominant chord. You can kind of play with your little flat 7 to the octave lower. You can play little root 5th to the flat 7 kind of move, and you can just kind of experiment a little bit. But I do like the foundation being, or I could flip those. Like instantly, that's super funky. I'm just kind of flipping the order that I'm putting these notes in from the 6th to the flat 7 to the minor third to the major third, or I can do it minor third to major third and then 6th to the flat 7. Either way, it works, and it's a great way to improvise. You know, there's a lot of cool stuff you can do. So take this, run with it, get those chord shapes under your fingers, and if you want to get tab notation, anything like that, please head over to my Patreon page, and you can find it there, as well as everything to go along with this channel. And in the meantime, happy practicing, everybody, and keep it groovy.